Please welcome to the stage Marcela Mulholland, Kyle Clark Sutton, Chris Neidl, Will Kain, and Sanjeev Menon for a panel on state and local policy leadership in scaling DAC.
Hello, good morning everyone. Today we're here to discuss the role of state and local policy leadership in scaling DAC with an all-star panel covering different perspectives on this. Yesterday, we heard from some great speakers about updates in federal policy, and there were great discussions among participants about demand, permitting reform, and more. Today, we'll discuss this and also hopefully emphasize why state and local governments aren't just a supporting act. They're key players in advancing this industry and in influencing federal action. States have unique resources, powers, and opportunities which allow them to test and implement solutions and have the rubber hit the road. In this session, we will explore how state and local leaders can accelerate DAC deployment, tailor solutions to specific regions, and create the policy environments necessary. The path forward on DAC will not be shaped only by federal mandates, but also by the actions of these leaders at the state and local levels. These policies are not mere add-ons, they're powerful drivers that can directly influence federal decision-making. So with that, I want to open this panel by asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves and also perhaps give a brief opening commentary on why state policy and action matter in 2025 or in any given year. So maybe we'll start with you, Kyle.
Great, thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm Kyle Clark Sutton. I'm a principal in the CDR initiative at RMI, and I lead our policy and markets work. A couple of things that we do at the state and local level is we have a tool called the State CDR Atlas, which pulls together publicly available data to shed light on the policy environment at the state level, as well as mapping that to natural resources and infrastructure to shed light on which states might be best for deployment for different approaches to CDR. And we also coordinate a state policy working group that's intended to support information sharing, but also drive action on state policy and engagement from you all in the industry to state campaigns that are being run or coordinated by working group members. So that's a plug for you all. You all are welcome. It's a monthly meeting. It's a light lift and a really useful communication tool to get more DAC companies involved in state policy. So, and really quickly, I think states are critical. I mean, I think no matter what political environment we're in at the federal level, states are incredibly important because they hold unique authorities and and understanding of their local environment, their local communities that are critical for deployment. And I'll turn it over to Marcela to take it.
Hello. Okay. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Marcela Mulholland. I lead policy advocacy at Clean Tomorrow, which is a new clean energy think tank focused on siting and deployment issues for the clean technologies of the future. Prior to this role, I was working with the Carbon Removal Alliance and helped lead stakeholder engagement for the Direct Air Capture Hubs program at OSED. So most of my work has focused more on the federal level, but certainly in light of kind of the vacuum of leadership that we're seeing federally right now, I think there's a really important role for states to play on a couple different areas that we can get more into as the panel progresses. I think on compliance markets, permitting, and procurement, there's a role for states to play in kind of leading in the acceleration and adoption of these technologies. I think perhaps on like a more existential level to start with, I think what we're seeing now federally is an attack on the idea that the public sector can and should play an active role in determining what the future technologies in this country look like. And so I think states can fight back by demonstrating that the government can work closely with the private sector to build projects quickly, effectively, and in a way that helps to set the U.S. on a leadership role globally for carbon removal and beyond. And I've been excited to see states like Colorado, California really lead in this way, and I think that we should see more of that in the coming years.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name's Will Kain. I'm the CEO of Avnos, which we talked a little bit about yesterday afternoon, is a direct air capture technology company based in Los Angeles with a laboratory and, as announced yesterday, a new project that we're building in New Jersey. And as everybody has said so far, states, really Sanjeev said it, states and local municipalities are where the rubber meets the road for CDR projects, for DAC projects, for projects of every kind, really. As Marcela just alluded to, the federal regulatory environment can set sort of the mood music, if you like, and push industries in one direction or another. But the only way that our projects, being selfish for Avnos and selfish for the DAC business, which is what we're all in this room to talk about, the only way our projects get built is with the support of and understanding from states and local governments. And a really critical aspect of what happens at the state level, we've built a project in California, we're building a project in New Jersey, and we're interacting with other states around the country, is that the environments in local areas determine the uncertainty under which we as DAC developers have to operate. And uncertainty can really be a killer, as many in this room know. As an example, not to pick on my beloved home state of California, but in asking the California, in asking CEQA, I blanked on what CEQA stands for, but in asking CEQA what it takes to get a permit to build a DAC plant in California, they'll tell you, well, it's maybe 12 or maybe 18 or maybe 24 months. And that's the same as infinity, right? Like if the gap is 12 full months for companies like many of the DAC developers in this room, that could be the difference between if we exist or don't, right? Having a project open on time is existential to some of the existence of and future progress of companies like ours. So it is at the state and local level where uncertainties are resolved and where much more transparency and visibility is provided to DAC developers like us that make or break a project, and in some cases can make or break the future of a given company. So I guess the TLDR is states are absolutely critical for what we're doing.
Great, thanks so much. Great to be here. Chris Neidl, I'm a proud founding board member of the DAC Coalition. 7 years ago, I founded the Open Air Collective, which is a all-volunteer advocacy network driving carbon dioxide removal policy, particularly at the state level. And one of the organizations that spun out of that is called the Four Corners Carbon Coalition. And that is at the local level, where we get a coalition of cities in the mountain states that collectively pool resources to fund first-of-kind CDR projects in that region. And as of 2 weeks ago, I became the carbon removal lead for an organization called the UN Climate Champions. And so my goal will be to try to take a lot of this work happening at the subnational level and bring it to the COP stage in Brazil and beyond. So really happy to be here. And why I think states are important. Everything said here, totally agree with, so I'll add one that maybe doesn't get thought about as much, but we're feeling it right now. Higher levels of political continuity. Right now, we need to have policies that are put in place that we can anticipate will stay in some shape or form in place for a long time. And at the federal level, we have slash and burn. We had the most remarkable CDR and DAC policies put forward anywhere in the world under the Biden administration, and now we're in a period of great uncertainty. There is turnover at the state level, but generally not as much turnover, so you can actually plan that policies can be maintained and built upon over the long term, and that's critically important for the DAC sector at this stage.
Chris, just to touch a little bit on that, can you provide for everyone a little bit of a high-level survey of the state legislation that's currently on board and what's been developing in the previous sessions as well?
Yeah, so it's been pretty exciting. Even to back up from that, there's a kind of a tension that exists, I think, is that in order to get carbon dioxide removal to sort of register, it kind of emanated from very high levels, from a IPCC report in 2018. Here's our graph, here's our timeline, and there's an incentive there, and it's scientifically accurate to talk about this has to be really big. It has to be gigatons. We have to think about it over the long term. The problem is that gets down even to the national, but certainly when it gets down to the subnational, that there's not a lot that policymakers can do about it at that level. So there's a limited number of places where you can just sort of pop into a state capitol or a legislature and say, carbon removal, we gotta do it big, right? So you gotta kind of lay the groundwork where you're getting conceptually carbon removal into the bloodstream first, or you're going through the side door where there's some linked sector, whether it's SAF or construction, and you're getting it in that way, right? So I think that the history of CDR policy in the state level has been more along those lines. There's been a couple that we've gone after, a limited number of states, the sort of climate forward states that have net zero commitments. They're in a position where they're like, I guess we kind of need carbon removal. So you can openly talk about carbon removal, on its own merits and why you want to do that. So we saw in that camp, California last session with SB 308, that was to try to really get CDR incorporated into their net zero and to make targets annually. And the successor bills that made it very far, but it didn't pass, but it helped open up the door. Right now, there's two really great bills that are live in California. One is basically a state version of kind of the DOE CDR procurement challenge. It's $80 million, SB 643, introduced by a very powerful, excellent sponsor. And then another one, which affects DAC, is we don't want CDR to just sort of slip into the far end of nature-based solutions. We need to have concepts of durability in statute and quality to make sure that we have a pool that will draw on DAC to meet that obligation. And then we'll talk about them as we go, because I could sit here and rattle off a lot. But I think two other spots that are really worth thinking about are Colorado. We were supposed to have our dear colleague Quinn Antis on stage with us today. She got sick, so she couldn't come. But Colorado is a unique state that it has real climate and emissions reductions commitments. It has storage potential, and it has background industries that are very relevant to what we do. But maybe most significantly, it has within the governor's office, within the state bureaucracy, some of the most knowledgeable, passionate, folks that really want to see this happen, and that really cannot be overstated how significant it is. And then lastly, I would say Massachusetts is an example of sneaking something in through the side door. Massachusetts just had this big $300 million Economic Development Act that it passed last year for climate tech, to make it easier to be a climate tech company in Massachusetts. So corporate tax credits, grants, loan forgiveness. And we were able to just get CDR as part of the definition of climate tech. So the next year, that means Massachusetts will become a very good place, to be a DAC company or a CDR company. So we'll get into all the other future ones because there is quite a bit going on, but hopefully that gives you a little taste.
Awesome, thank you. And I want to direct a different version of that question to you, Kyle. In your vantage point at RMI, how are you seeing that these state and local authority decision-making influences real-world impacts and outcomes for DAC?
I mean, I think that, in some ways, the story diverges depending on the state and the political climate of that state. In states like California and Washington, you see some momentum because they have net zero commitments or climate targets. You see some momentum around laying some of the foundational policy groundwork, so defining what good looks like. So the bill, I'm blanking on the number right now, but the 285, SB 285 that Chris just mentioned is establishing, what high quality CDR looks like in California, and so in that sense you can start to carve out space for DAC amongst nature-based solutions or other approaches. It at least establishes the rules of the road. In Colorado, they're taking the approach of looking at what are some real-world deployment barriers or challenges that we have to think about over the long term to ensure that Colorado is a good place to do business for DAC. So there's a bill in the legislature right now that's looking at long-term stewardship of carbon storage. So they're thinking about, okay, what are the speed bumps we're going to hit down the road and that are going to potentially make it difficult for DAC to deploy or create vulnerabilities for DAC with communities and trying to proactively resolve those. And Colorado, I think, is a great mix of progressive. They have climate targets, but they're also very pragmatic. They have a memorandum of understanding with Wyoming, for example, to partner on carbon storage and deal with some of the thorny issues around pore space and things like that. And so I think depending on the state you go to, there are different opportunities to advance different things. I think the other thing in states like Texas or Louisiana, where you're not likely to see a ton of momentum to force carbon removal or anything like that, but there's an appetite for business in those states, and so thinking about how the environment in those states can be conducive to DAC, while making sure that there are opportunities or there's a clear pathway for permitting these types of projects is important, but also engaging with the utilities and engaging with the utility commissions to ensure that there's a smooth pathway for DAC to integrate with the energy system can also be really critical too.
If I could just add one thing to that, and it's important just from a political perspective not to get those two categories of states crossed. You're going to get the fact that California does something we've seen so many times that can create a domino effect where you get, Oregon and Washington and maybe the East Coast not too far along. But that is not what you're going to evoke when you're talking about these states where we actually need to do the projects, which tend to be the Wyomings, the Dakotas, Louisiana, and Texas. So there's just like one major theme that should arise from this is that you have to sort of tailor make the policy asks in states based on the politics of the place, not just the sort of the resources. So anyway, important point to make.
And if I may just add there, I think what you're each pointing out is that there's a little something for everybody in state and local style policies and politics. California, Colorado, and Massachusetts politically look more like one another, but resource-wise, they look very different. Massachusetts, you're not going to store any CO2 in the subsurface, but there is an opportunity to create a conducive political environment for DAC companies in Massachusetts. And Louisiana, North Dakota, Wyoming look more like one another politically, less like California, Colorado, and Massachusetts, but they've gone and gotten primacy rights and have taken their own steps to create a conducive political environment for DAC. So I think it's an interesting space in that there's a little bit of something for everybody at that state and local level.
Totally. And as a supplier for you, you're looking at a combination of conditions. You're thinking about resources, policy, the business and regulatory environment. If you had to choose, what are those categories or areas of policy action on the state level that you're most concerned about as a supplier? And how do you rank those in importance with the overall set of factors that your business has to contend with to make these projects happen?
Yeah, no state can do much about their own geography, as we're just talking about. Whether you can sequester CO2 is not up to Massachusetts, right? That's geology underneath where Massachusetts sits, and nor can Massachusetts or Louisiana do anything about their own climate, the actual environmental climate. So in the context of each of those unique characteristics, geography and climate of any given state or local area, as you think about what are the things that are important for us, I said it at the beginning, it's reducing uncertainty. How can states deliver or give us a roadmap, even if in the California example, if the CEQA process is 24 months, make it 24 months, right? And make that clear so that project developers and technology developers have that clarity. And so the things where does clarity help the most in that frame really is on permitting, right? That's the biggest. That's not particularly novel, a particularly novel insight, but it is permitting. How long is it going to take, and how much is it going to cost for us to get from a decision to build a project in California or Louisiana or anywhere else to actual commercial operations on a state regulatory basis. Obviously, there are a number of other things that go into what ultimately brings a project to life, but permitting would be number one. And then, Kyle, I think you just said it, but maybe an area that is sometimes overlooked is what is the power regime, and how do you get to the electric power regime, not the political power regime, although that is also important. But interacting with local utilities and public utility commissions is what is the access to power, how can we tie into the grid, what are the color of the electrons, so to speak, what do the RECs markets, the renewable energy credit markets look like in any given state or locality. That's another really important one, which I guess goes to the third that I would say, and Chris, you've been on this, is creating demand signals at the state and local level as well. And that doesn't have to be like big dollars. It doesn't have to be the state of Ohio, pick a new state, because I've said the same states a few times, but the state of Ohio doesn't have to commit tens and tens of millions of dollars to buying DAC credits, but creating an environment of demand support, I think, is another area where states can really lean in and have a significant bang for their buck.
If I could just build on the permitting point, I think we're seeing the political consensus on permitting change in real time, where both Democratic states and Republicans in Congress are moving in the direction of trying to streamline permitting for all kinds of energy projects. There are many state-level initiatives in Pennsylvania, California, Oregon, Minnesota, to name a few, where the governors and state legislatures have moved to create, whether it's like a fast-track committee or actually changing and synthesizing the timelines for state approval for permits. A lot of it has focused on clean and renewable energy so far. I think the recognition has like kind of first shifted in that direction as different localities have passed bans on renewable energy. I think there's like a movement toward leveling up the decision-making authority to the state level. I would love to see that start to happen for carbon removal and DAC specifically. I think there's a challenge where a lot of local permitting authorities have never heard or are relatively inexperienced with some of the technologies that we're talking about today. And so there's more reticence toward streamlining permitting for technologies that are newer, but we're going to need to scale these up really quickly. And there are existing policy solutions that have been pursued and successful for other parts of the energy sector on permitting that we should expand to include carbon removal.
No, I think you summed it up quite well. There's a lot of ground to cover, but yeah.
Awesome. I want to switch a little bit from state policy to also include federal policy. And Marcela, you work a bit in this space. And as we've already discussed, federal and state policy developments and possibilities are tied together on a number of fronts. And we're finding ourselves in a moment of unprecedented hostility to climate and environmental regulations at the federal level. In prior years, we have seen states emerge in the absence or withdrawal of these federal policies and leadership. And I think it's appropriate for us to take stock of what's happening in Washington right now and how that's kind of shifting the burden of leadership to states, while it's also possibly making it harder for these states to be able to lead. So Marcela, can you paint for us a general picture of what sort of DAC-supportive Biden policies are being impacted or dismantled, and where do you see these states potentially filling the gap?
Yeah, so contrary to my open remarks, I'm actually not that cynical on this. I feel like I lipped out a little too hard at the beginning. I think that Chris Wright has been actually quite, I think, some of his statements in his confirmation hearings have been more positive toward the need to cement the U.S. as a leader in innovation and wanting to continue the department's role in kind of spearheading and pioneering the technologies of the future. So I actually think Chris Wright is a potential ally for all of these technologies, and I don't think that we should by any means see the federal government as totally abdicating leadership on these programs. Obviously with the Department of Government Efficiency kind of going around and looking for places to cut, people are rightfully concerned. I will say I went on the Doge website this morning just for you guys just to check where things stand. And the Department of Energy is actually one of the agencies that they list as having the least cuts that they have pursued. It's actually behind even the Department of Defense, which I think was surprising to me. You guys should go on the website. It has had some factual errors, so don't quote me on, I'm quoting the website. I don't know if the website is accurate, but they list basically the top 10 agencies that they have found programs to cut from, and DOE is not at all near the top. And so I think that speaks to the administration's perspective of the value of the department. When Trump came into office, obviously the Unleashing American Energy executive order kind of concerned people. We're ending the Green New Deal. I didn't know that we even started the Green New Deal, but I think there is definitely still an opportunity for the IRA, specifically the CDR programs that are funded in the IRA, to continue to move forward. That being said, I think states have a role to play in continuing to make the case that the government can and should be a responsible and important partner to industry in developing these technologies. I'm eager to see how the department under the new leadership kind of pursues these programs. I think there's a lot of fear in the climate community that like this marks the end of the success of like any of the climate wins from the last administration, and I just don't think that that's the case. There are, as everyone knows, a lot of the bill and IRA dollars are going to Republican-controlled states and congressional districts. I think there's a lot of vested interest from Republican members of Congress in seeing these projects and programs succeed, selfishly because of their own constituents. And so I think, obviously, we've been talking about the importance of state-level policy here, but I think I will be looking to see the DAC programs continue. I think they will definitely change shape. You will notice many of my former DOE colleagues are not here today. I think there's still a lot of uncertainty, and they feel like they can't answer many questions decisively, understandably, given the kind of, we're still just a couple months in, right? Like there's still plenty that will change, and we'll see things evolve in the coming months. But I'm excited about the programs that we work to build, and I think that they will continue in one form or another.
Yeah, I just want to plus one kind of the optimism or looking for the opportunities in this new environment. I think there are some things that have been holding back direct air capture at the federal level that we could see change in a positive way in the next 4 years. One of them is regulations around pipeline safety for CO2 from PHMSA. And then the other is permitting of Class 6 wells and awarding primacy to states to permit those Class 6 wells. Now, of course, we need to, and it really is on us as a field to push for rigorous standards and rules that keep everybody safe and hold the industry to a high level of accountability, because we want to, it's very difficult to build trust. It's very easy to lose trust. And so those, we want those rules to be high integrity and high quality, but I'm hoping that we will see, in this administration, which seems to be more pro-business, pro-deployment, can we see some acceleration of some of these permits or these permitting processes and safety rules such that it creates a more clear, certain playing field at the state level, and states can then pick that mantle up and carry it forward.
There is an interesting political dynamic between that and states where we want to root for that, obviously, that there's continuity and maintenance of programs and even maybe some improvement in certain areas under the current administration. But for any of us who have advocated for CDR policies at the state level, our biggest opposition and most consistent opposition are environmental groups of various different kinds, and they tell the story of, well, this is either a smokescreen or a moral hazard producing sort of preference of tech bros and oil companies. And so there will be an interesting thing as we try to mount a case for this in places like California and New York and Massachusetts and Washington. that the perception that the only one that's left standing of the sort of the climate sort of framework under Biden is carbon management, it reinforces that sort of perception. So complicated thing to navigate, but we're going to have to get used to navigating a lot of these things between the Fed and the state.
And I just want to announce that, you know, in about 10 minutes, we will be taking audience questions. So have some questions prepared for our lovely panelists. But thank you for talking about kind of the intersection of federal and state policy. I want to go back to something that we talked about a little earlier, which is, you know, the demand policies that what are the demand signals that we can imagine, right? So what does the ideal sort of demand support model look like for you, Will, as a DAC supplier?
Yeah, it's a very good and important question, and I think you can kind of think of it in two tracks, and there are carrots and sticks, right? And in this country, we've spent more of our time and energy on carrots, the 45Q style tax credit, investment tax credits are more carrots. In other jurisdictions around the world, you see more in the way of sticks. So I'll stick on the carrot side of the equation because that seems to be our preferred methodology across this country. And you know, things like tax credits certainly are helpful. And again, as I say, set the overall kind of tone for support for our industry. But at the state and local level, obviously, just there are fewer zeros available in the tax credit budget to support our projects. And in that kind of realm of fewer zeros than at the federal level, I actually think that something that looks a bit like the DOE's CDR purchase prize program at a state level makes a lot of sense. As I said a moment ago, I think you get real bang for the buck there. Right, in supporting the capital expenditures required to build our units. Every DAC developer in this room is aware of how much it costs to build even a demo scale facility of any meaningful size. There are a lot of zeros there. So that's a harder, maybe a longer putt, so to speak, in supporting the capital expenditures required to build units. So states, like in deploying millions of dollars toward buying CDR credits, buying DAC credits from our projects, that helps to set the stage for then our ability to finance those projects and build those projects and bring those projects to life. And the other thing you see in those kinds of government purchasing programs is that they bring in other interests, they bring in other buyers, right? To focus for a moment on that, the CDR purchase prize, the original $35 million that the Department of Energy committed to the CDR purchase prize fairly quickly brought in an additional $35 million in matching funds from Google to stand next to the Department of Energy and buy DAC credits. Well, that program's brought CDR broadly, but brought in $35 million from Google to buy credits alongside the government. So I think, again, you can see that at state and local levels, and the cool thing about state and local demand support programs is that they can prioritize the things that are important in those jurisdictions, in those subnational jurisdictions, because what is good for Illinois is different than what's good for Kentucky, is different than what's good for Oklahoma, and those local leaders can help to tailor those programs and structure those demand support programs such that you have the opportunity to bring in additional local support. I think that whether it be business or individual taxpayers, in such a fashion as to, again, get that bang for the buck, get real leverage on committing dollars at the state and local level to buy from our projects.
Yeah, I think that's great. I'm a big fan of procurement for all the reasons that Will said, but I think it also plays another kind of role of positioning at this early stage where if you're going to align CDR with net zero, where you get to the 2050s, and now you're talking about some really, really significant volumes, I don't know if a procurement model is necessarily the best model to take us all the way to that end of the curve. But at this stage, just look what the federal program even did. You know, you can say, this is the methodology we used. This is how it was approved. These are the projects that we selected. It gives you, it addresses a lot of the concerns that people have about this being a false solution or being fake. And if you're able to actually show the best of CDR and why you did it for procurement, There's also another kind of policy that's not talked about that could link the two things you talked about. If a state comes in and says, we're going to do this by, and they announce it, they become a sort of an anchor, off-taker, or whatever. But what if you, for taxpayers in state, they get a tax credit, or if they're a covered facility, that if they buy CDR, they get a preferential treatment in terms of how that's accounted for in terms of their obligation. So there's a lot of different ways that it could be played around with. But I do think that the cap and trade part is another way that people are thinking about it. Do you create another obligation that covered facilities would have to start buying carbon removals in addition to their offsets or their other obligations? But I think procurement has a really sort of special place right now because it does those two things. It creates demand and it creates transparency.
I'll just say we talked about the purchase price a little bit, but there is a new bill in California that's proposing $80 million in CDR procurement at the state level. I don't know if you have other thoughts on it, but I was excited to see the demand policy go beyond just the federal level and actually reach state policymakers as well. I think we'll need that.
And just a question for all the panelists here. What do we think about like city or municipal level policies?
Just to underscore it, Marcela, though, like that bill we mentioned before, it's called SB 643. It is sponsored by Senator Caballero, who's a very powerful, very effective legislator. I think it's one of those ones where all eyes in the world should kind of be looking at what is happening in California around there, because it's the most clear, direct sort of demand signal, great policy idea. So, and just a little plug, the DAC coalition, we've created a state and local level policy kind of action group that we presented on last month. Come up to me if you want to join it, but we definitely want to row in behind and make that bill a success and pass that, because that would be a really significant one. On the city level, if I might just add, all the zeros things that Will was just talking about, you even have less zeros. And it's a time of enormous uncertainty for cities around what's happening at the federal level. And then that means there's going to be these knock-on effects where states are going to have to, carbon removal is sort of the last guy in, first one out. It's not the kind of thing in belt tightening moments that you're going to be splurging on carbon removal. But I think what they can do is, there's a lot of cities, obviously by definition, local governments. In aggregate, even small commitments to CDR purchasing, we have hundreds of cities in this country that have committed to net zero. And they're like, how do we do that? So if you can start even getting relatively small amounts in high volumes, that matters. But it produces a different look, because we have that problem of CDR kind of coming from on high as an abstraction. If you are then able to look at, wow, look at all of these cities all over the country that are at least making symbolic commitments and putting their hands up for it, that changes the political atmosphere for trying to push for state-level policy and ultimately national policy. So they play a really important messaging role, I would say, if you can get more and more of those cities that are incorporating and using the language of CDR in their own local targets.
Any other thoughts from the panelists? No? Okay, great. Kyle, I want to ask you, can you give us a thumbnail sketch of maybe some of the kinds of preconditions that are most likely to support, or cities that are states that are most likely to support these like serious policy initiatives to create demand for CDR?
I think if you're talking about demand specifically, at least currently, one of the main preconditions is that it's a pretty progressive state, and usually they have some kind of binding, sometimes non-binding, in the case of Colorado, climate targets that create some pressure and give advocates sort of an artifact to use to put pressure on the government to think about the best way to approach demand. I think that there's also Chris was talking about Senator Caballero in California, especially in this political environment where fiscal constraints are being felt pretty heavily. You need a strong ally in the legislature to get these types of policies introduced in the first place. Although I'll check myself and say, even in California, where the state has recognized the need for carbon removal, So there's multiple avenues to creating demand, one of which is through the CARB, the California Air Resources Board, and their work to update regulations around cap and trade or the low carbon fuel standard. And so a lot of times what we're looking for in turn to create these demand signals, if it's not sort of a procurement bill from whole cloth, we're looking for what are the existing policies in place that you can integrate carbon removal into as an eligible pathway for compliance. And so states where we have clean fuel standards, cap and trade, buy clean bills, and things like that, a lot of times these policies are creating mechanisms to drive emissions reductions, but we all know that we're not going to be able to eliminate every single ton of emissions, and so over the long term we will need CDR to reach net zero. And so to the extent that we can start to build those pathways into these existing frameworks, that creates an opportunity too that's not subject to the legislative process necessarily, depending on the state.
If just to underscore that too, is you look around, how is the table already set? And are there things that you can kind of sneak into? And what Kyle just brought up around buy clean. So we've been talking about procurement as direct procurement of CDR, but multiple states now have these other actual procurement policies where the materials that they buy, building materials that they're major purchases of, they have to meet certain standards. Indirectly, though, you could see things where the utilization of carbonated, carbonates that are used in concrete or SAF and fuels like that governments do purchase that are linked to direct air capture. We want to make sure we're present in those policies as well to see if there are DAC-related products that could potentially play in those, and then you'd have demand not for the CDR but for the product. So that's another terrain that is ripe for our invasion.
Absolutely. We have just over 4 minutes, so we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. If you have a question, you can come right to the mic on the right. And
a pleasure being here today. My name is Graciela Chichulniski, and maybe some of you know who I am. Just everything you're talking about here is like direct air capture and the carbon removal, and now the creation of a carbon removal market are things that I have been doing. So I feel very, very good to hear what you're saying. And it's just the time. We only have a time problem. It's just very serious time problem. But the money is moving things, and it's happening. So I think that there should be a session dedicated to putting some of these plans into action. And it is possible. I patented the carbon removal market, which never existed. And that was done a few months ago. And this is where the money is going to go now. I patented the background for the 45Q that I suggested to
Graciela,
Senator Whitehouse.
Is there a question, Graciela?
And my question is, do we have a plan, and can we discuss a plan here for what you guys are talking? I mean, there is 150 of these companies now that do direct air capture. It should be possible to organize those companies into a group.
That's a good segue. As I mentioned before, we just started last month the DAC Coalition's own native policy team involving members. And we've had a good sort of participation in that. But I think that DAC has to kind of start to plow its own way in terms of the policy that it needs. The stuff that Will was talking about, that's not going to be floating around in the discussions at NRDC or EDF, great organizations. But as we've learned from other areas of climate tech, wind, solar, batteries, we have to kind of pave our own way policy-wise. So it's really important that DAC isn't just sort of sidecar to other coalitions, but that our coalition itself becomes a force for policy change. So to what Graciela was just mentioning, come approach me. We are going to be having a convening very soon around our policy agenda for 2025.
But
2026.
also, let's extend to carbon removal, because I think a carbon removal market is billions in the making. I already patented that carbon removal market, and
I think that's a great idea that maybe we can.
We're at time.
Yes.
I created
bring
the
together.
European Union emission trading system.
Yeah.
And that was
Thank you for that.
Got it.
And it's now $800 billion in trading. So that can be done. We can do it right now.
And with that, we have come to time on this panel. So thank you so much to all of our panelists. I hope this was a very helpful conversation exploring some of the policy tools, different funding mechanisms, thoughts on kind of creating demand-side policies. So thank you so much, everyone.